Well, dealing with a lot of chefs in this area, majority of them are basically pushing towards restaurant or culinary use. You know, whether it be stock pots, chinois, silpats, which are silicone baking sheets. You know, it's a wide range of things. Cake rings, which typically you don't see in a regular, department store. You know, it's more of a gourmet level chef store, with a chef shop. Average lifespan of a knife, if you use your sharpening stone, you maintain your edge with it. In an industry level, the average lifespan I would say would be up to 8-10 years. Some people will say a lifetime, but if you're really honing your edge, keeping it very sharp, 8-10 years is a long time to get out of a good quality knife. But they're very personal to a chef. As everybody always hears, it's the extension of their arm. So it's a tool that they use constantly, and it comes down to preference, and it comes down to their personal feel of the knife. Typically when the wear and tear of a knife is if somebody's cutting on a wrong surface, if they're throwing their knives in sinks to get clean, tips getting broke, reshaping, not maintaining the edge with sharpening stones, then they have to bring it someplace to get material removed. So there you lose years upon years every time you have that done. Grinding a knife too often is going to take the life away from the knife. Grinding should be done when the knife loses its shape from working with stones. Typically your edge is going to get wavy just from using a stone. You can't incorporate that edge for the life of the knife. So you have to bring it someplace to get it reshaped. Now, if you wait too long to have that done, too much material has to be removed. Thus, 2-3 years is taken away from the life of the knife. Stone maintenance, in my opinion, should be done 2 to 3 times a week, if not more. If you're not feeling the cuts the way you should, if it's not cutting clean, after work that night, you go and you work on your stone. Keep your edge very keen. Once it goes dull, you have to remove a lot of material. The key is, don't wait till your knife is dull to go to a sharpening stone. Maintain your sharpness of your knife with a stone. Well, typically there's a purpose for a knife, and it should be used for the proper job. If you take a chef's knife, this is your workhorse in the kitchen. This is used for dicing, chopping, mincing, going through large root vegetables. And that's what it's meant to be used for. If you take a utility knife, which is this, and try to do that job with this knife, it's apt to bend, break, again, takes away from the life of the knife. So each knife has its own job. Paring knives for smaller jobs, peeling, small little cuts, bread knives, serrated knives for cutting thick crusted breads, slicers for slicing meats, and then your chef's knives for dicing, chopping, and mincing. Okay, of course you have your handle, okay. The different parts of the chef's knife, your handle, you have this big thick part right here, which is common in a fully forged knife, meaning it's pounded into the shape, is your bolster, your blade, of course your tip, and what they call the spline of the knife. Different knives are going to have different handles. Here you have a riveted handle, here a molded handle. Typically a riveted handle is going to have what they call a full tang. Molded handle is going to have a tang that typically goes back 3/4, which the material is molded around. We were always told, growing up, always look for a full tang knife. When you get into quality cutlery, that theory gets thrown right out the window. What it comes down to is every company is going to have different handles. Whether it's Wusthof with their 8-inch chef's knife, there's a molded handle and a riveted handle. If I took this and covered up that handle, you couldn't tell them apart. The blades are exactly the same. But you pick the knife up, and typically a riveted handled knife is going to feel a little bit heavier. The weight's going to be distributed differently, thus feeling totally different in your hand. So it's a preference thing on riveted handles, molded handles. Wooden handles, you have to put put nutrients back into those handles. If you're cutting poultry, meats, fish, stuff like that, you want to clean the handle very well with bleach, detergents to get it clean. Let it dry, but you always have to put oils back into the handle to give it nutrients. If you don't, they dry out, they crack, and they break off. Well, typically majority of these knives you see, knives on this whole wall come with a guarantee. So if something happens to this knife in its life, a rivet comes out or the handle cracks, it gets replaced. So the guarantee of this knife, if you come back to me 8 years from now, the handle broke off, I'll send it back and they'll replace it for you. If you start seeing knife damage, cracks in your blade, put the knife down, bring it to someone reputable, ask them what's wrong with it and get it replaced. If you're working, you're trying to crack a joint with the heel of this knife and the blade breaks, it's a very dangerous tool and it should be respected. Different options of knife handle besides riveted and molded. A lot of companies are coming out with stainless steel, okay, which is put together as a molded handle. It's just a lot heavier knife, totally different feel. And as you can see, the blades are exactly alike. Comes down to personal preference, how it feels in the user's hand. The handle is molded right around the tang of the knife on a molded handle. Riveted handle, it's actually punched right through the tang of the knife and attached. Different lengths, different jobs. Different lengths knives, if you're doing a small job, peeling a potato, slicing up some radishes, 3.5-inch paring knife is fine. If you're getting into, say, you want to cut up a grapefruit, or maybe you want to use a 4.5 to a 5-inch utility knife to take up for the size of that vegetable. Slicers and bread knives, 8-inch in the knife field typically means carving knife. When you start getting up to 9, 10, they switch it over, they call it a slicer. Some slicers have a rounded tip, typically used for bone-out meats. Meats without a bone, a regular roast or a pork loin. Knives with a point are used for bone-in meats, hams, to get around bone, to use the tip. Different size chef's knives, just for different size jobs. Now they're coming out with what they call the Santoku, which this is an Asian-style Santoku, but Wusthof, Henkel, every company makes them. And what it does, it's taking the place of what you would use a smaller chef's knife for. I purchased a Santoku about 12 years ago, and that's the knife I use all the time now. I rarely ever grab my chef's knife. There's some different fillet knives. The fillet knives are typically going to be very flexible. That's because you're going to actually manipulate the blade to bend to either take fillets out or take outer skin off a fish. Some fillet knives can be used either as a flexible boning knife or a fillet knife. This is flexible enough to fillet, but as a boning knife, you can manipulate the blade also around bones. There's all different shapes, all different lengths, and that comes down to the user's preference. Some people like a wider blade. Typically, fillets float a little bit easier over a wider blade. Some people like a very narrow, longer blade. So that all comes down to preference. Every company carries fillet knives. Handles are different. In industry and meat packing houses, you're going to use more of an industrial fillet knife. You wouldn't pick up something like this. You get something with a rubber gripped handle. Your hands are always wet. It's just preference on how it feels. Typically a fully forged knife, a knife like this, is pounded into that shape. Just like a blacksmith would make a horseshoe. It's pounded into the shape it is. What happens when you start pounding something is you break down the crystalline structure of this. Makes it denser, makes the steel harder, enables them to heat treat it differently. A stamp bladed knife, like this one, is just stamped out of a piece of steel, it's heat treated. So typically, edge retention on this lasts a lot longer. Stamp bladed knife, the edge won't last as long, easier to sharpen, harder to sharpen. The thinness of the blade. But it has to do what you call in metallurgy, take a set, which means if I take this knife and bend it, it's going to take a set and go back to shape. Some knives don't take a set. They're lower quality knives, which typically aren't going to hold an edge. It's going to be very difficult to sharpen, meaning you'll remove material quickly, but there's not going to be an edge there. Typically, your German-style knives being fully forged have a bolster, which we showed you on these knives over here. Chefs will use that to crack joints, to break apart things. It's the heaviest part of the knife. That's a German-style knife. Henkel and their molded handle and riveted have a bolster. Wusthof and their lines have a bolster. Messermeister has a bolster but they stop at about 3/4 of the way down the blade. What is nice about that is if you're when you do sharpen with a waterstone, oil stone, you don't have to contend with this bolster, okay? You just sharpen it just the way you would any other knife, but it's going to wear, in my opinion, a little bit better. Which brings us into the Asian style knife, which doesn't have a bolster. That's the style of an Asian knife. Bolsterless, very thin, and very hard steel. One of my favorites is Kikuichi, and how they make their knives, it's an inner core carbon steel. They wrap it with a stainless steel. What that enables them to do is temper this inner core a lot differently. If they didn't wrap it with a stainless steel and you drop this knife, it would break. That's how hard the inner core is. Care to be taken with a knife like this is if you're doing any vegetables, parsley, lettuces, you want to rinse them good, get all the sand particles out. Sand is very hard and it'll actually chip the edges of these knives up. That's how hard the steel is. The core of these knives, it's made in such a way the outer core is very soft. So as you sharpen the knife through its life, it's going to recede back the same way it is when you first buy it. We commonly use an equal bevel on either side of our knives. Asian style is 70-30. They do a lot of meat, a lot of fish, and it's a lot easier to sharpen a bevel that's 70-30. If you look at a sushi knife, it's typically one-sided, straight and flat on the back with a little tiny edge running down. It's great for cutting meat, it's great for cutting fish. You get a nicer cut. That's Asian style of sharpening. With German style knives, because of the thickness of the spline of the knife, it's just a lot easier to recede that edge back at equal on both sides. Degree is typically about 22 degrees that you're going to hold the knife for its bevel. Asian style knives, you can drop that down because they're so thin to about 10 degrees. 70 meaning 70% of your sharpening on one side, 30% bevel on the other side. Okay, the German style, the way we would sharpen would be equal on either side. You could say 50-50. The angle that you're holding it at is going to be about 22 degrees, 22 degrees. Asian style knives, because of the thinness, typically going to be about 10-12 degrees. The Asian style knives have always been around. I think they're coming more prominent because the Food Network, different chefs out in the industry are starting to use them and they're talking about them. So people that are working in to get into the industry, they're interested in how the knives are made. They start to use them and you feel a totally different knife in your hand. They're typically a lot lighter, they seem to cut nicer, and they're easier to maintain the edge. You know, it's a very user-friendly knife.